This hearing of the Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Today, we hear from the heads of the U.S. Agency for International Development and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and together these agencies account for $21.3 billion, or 41% of the President's $52 billion international affairs budget request. Especially given our chronic federal deficit, we must be rethinking how and where and why we provide foreign aid. To be justified, the bar is high. Aid must support our national security, and it has to support our economic interests. And it must be efficient, and it has to be effective. It must advance democratic principles and develop reliable trade partners. And it must be implemented in a way that breaks the cycle of dependency. Over the past decade, USAID has seen its mission chipped away. The Global AIDS Coordinator, who manages the largest U.S. global health program in history, is housed in the State Department. The MCC has been created as an independent agency with a mandate to reduce poverty through economic growth. So it has been a challenging time for USAID. Indeed, the Bush administration stood up MCC, Millennium Challenge, as an alternative, a way to break with the tired old development approaches that for decades have failed. But MCC has had its challenges too. So-called compacts in the early days were big, they were complicated, they were overly optimistic. This has improved some, but MCC must stay true to itself. Getting pulled into countries where you don't belong could ruin MCC's recipe for success. By demanding that countries we are aiding have good policies in place, by strictly monitoring and elevating impact, MCC has served as a lab for what does and does not work. It is getting countries on a path towards graduation from foreign assistance. And that is why many of the administration's new initiatives are borrowing from the MCC model. This is progress if it is well implemented. The President's proposal to reform the International Food Program, helping more at less cost, is a bright spot in the budget request. For much of our food aid, this proposal would remove conditions that commodities be U.S. bought and U.S. shipped. Studies have shown that these conditions only make for a slow and inefficient program, and I will add that in terms of being U.S. flagged shipped, those ships are owned by a foreign carrier in Scandinavia anyway. It is elementary that buying food closer to where the humanitarian crisis is taking place is faster, it's cheaper, it helps save more lives. Only in recent years has the U.S. been able to experiment with a small pilot program to buy food close to the crisis. This local and regional purchase effort has been found to be 11 to 14 weeks faster. It's also been found to be 25 to 50% cheaper. Essentially, the administration's proposal would end a process called monetization. This is when Washington buys American grain, gives it to international charities, who in turn sell it in poor countries. Congress's investigative arm called this process inherently inefficient and found that it resulted in the loss of $219 million over 3 years. That's an average of 25 cents on every taxpayer dollar. It's not just the waste that should bother us, but the harmful impact of dumping such commodities, which can destroy local farming and, in turn, increase the dependency on aid that we'd like to see end. So I look forward to working with Ambassador Shaw as well as the ranking member to advance this ambitious and timely program. And I will now turn to Mr. Sherman of California to recognize him for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I don't know if any of my Democratic colleagues would like me to yield a minute to them, but if they indicate that I will. If not, I will give a hastily created opening statement.
In the absence of Mr. Engel, that opening statement is appreciated, and
It's,
we will give you that time.
and its quality will reflect the number of seconds I've had to prepare it. Our development aid is the right thing to do, and that is reason enough for us to pay for it. But the American people are also told that it achieves our foreign policy objectives. One of those objectives is to lift all the boats in the world, because it's in our foreign policy and economic interest that the countries of the world be able to afford our products. It is said often by the proponents of foreign aid that it is the most poor and dispossessed that become terrorists and wage war against us, but the vast majority of the 9/11 hijackers came from one of the wealthiest countries in the Middle East. One element of improving our image in the world is whether we tell people who are getting our aid that it is in fact American aid. One thing that disturbs me with our aid with regard to Syria, but also other places, is that we are deliberately obscuring the fact that the aid comes from the United States. The American people will occasionally face a Hobson's choice. Do you provide aid to people who live in communities where there's such antagonism to America that if they knew the aid came from the United States, they may not want it? And yet, Syria is, of course, a difficult situation for us. So I will be asking our witnesses what we're doing to make sure that the recipients of the aid know that this comes from the generosity of the American people, and where there are circumstances where, in order for the aid to be effective, accepted, in order for people to be willing to work with us, or in order for aid workers to be safe, we have to obscure that fact. Picking up on the Chairman's comments about local sourcing, I will want to hear your comments there. One thing to keep in mind is that one element of the coalition in support of American food aid is American agriculture. Do we give up some of that support in order to be more efficient, perhaps spending a few less dollars a lot more efficiently to provide food aid around the world? As Mr. Royce points out, selling our commodities in third world countries as part of a U.S. government program may drive prices down and disrupt local markets. There are also circumstances, particularly where there's disaster nearby where we have to buy food, where buying a lot of food which might seem to help the local economy can disrupt it and bid up the cost of food. Those analyzing the Arab Spring have pointed out that it may have been caused as much as anything by the increase in food prices in the Arab world that occasioned a worldwide increase in commodity prices. Looking for some indication that somebody, I yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Berra from California.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing. I look forward to the testimony. Obviously, USAID supports the moral and values of our country. As a nation of abundance, one of our best approaches to diplomacy is sharing that abundance with the rest of the world. It is, the Food for Peace program obviously has been a wonderful program, not only for our agriculture sector, not only for our farmers, but for the goodwill of the United States. And I look forward to the testimony. I look forward to looking at how to make this the most efficient program possible, as well as continuing to support American diplomacy through the USAID program. So I'm very interested in the testimony and looking for ways that Congress continues to partner with USAID. So with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And the Chair is pleased to yield 2 minutes for an opening statement from Mr. Smith, the Chairman of the Global Health Subcommittee.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to express my deepest appreciation to Dr. Shah for your extraordinary leadership on so many fronts and the emphasis that USAID is giving to nutrition and food security, and particularly our foreign assistance to ensure proper nutrition in the first 1,000 days of children's lives from conception to the second birthday, to reduce the impact of malnutrition that leads to a myriad of health problems, including stunted growth and development of an estimated 165 million children under the age of 5 in the world today. In September 2010, I joined 7 African First Ladies in New York City at a roundtable initiative launch of this initiative. What was abundantly clear then has only been reinforced by empirical data that shows that the first 1,000 days of life is a unique once-in-a-lifetime window of opportunity for better health. And it is without parallel. Much has been achieved. Obviously, much more needs to be done. The UNICEF issued a landmark report, an extraordinary call for further action, called Improving Child Nutrition, the Achievable Imperative for Global Progress. UNICEF's Executive Director, Anthony Lake, says the legacy of the first 100,000 days of a child's life can last forever. The right start in a life is a healthy start, and it's only the start from which children can realize their promise and potential. He says we owe it to every child, everywhere. The report further reinforces a growing international consensus that this nutritional focus deserves a much higher priority in international development initiatives than was generally or previously realized. The UNICEF report emphasized that, and I quote it here, ensuring adequate micronutrient status in women of reproductive age, pregnant women and children, improves the health of expectant mothers, the growth and development of unborn children, and the survival and physical and mental development of children up to 5 years of age, close quote. USAID's Feed the Future strategic focus on improving nutrition during the first 1,000 days of life is one of the most important contributions that our foreign assistance can make to global health, and it works synergistically with initiatives to mitigate malaria, HIV/AIDS, TB, and other devastating diseases around the world, but including and especially on the subcontinent of Africa. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. And our last opening statement will be made by Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses, and welcome to the committee. I want to just begin by thanking you for your leadership and work. And as we all know, our investments in development and aid are not only important for us to do in terms of our national security, but they're important because the American people benefit when we help to create a more stable, more democratic world. I particularly want to compliment you on the work that is being done to reform our food aid, the whole USAID forward, which I'm anxious to hear more about, the great work that the MCC has done in Cape Verde and in other places around the world. And this is an opportunity, I think, for us to really reinforce our responsibility to make these kinds of investments around the world, which is one of the great strengths of America, that we bring these values and the democratic values that we all share. And I just want to compliment both of our witnesses for your outstanding work and look forward to your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And this morning we are joined by Rajiv Shah, the administrator of USAID, and Daniel Yohannes, the Chief Executive Officer of the MCC. Dr. Shah is the 16th administrator of USAID. Previously, he served as Undersecretary of Research, Education, and Economics at USAID and Chief Scientist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Welcome, Dr. Shah. And then we will hear from Dr. Yohannes, who was confirmed as the CEO of the MCC in 2009. Prior to his appointment, he held positions in the financial services sector, including as the Vice Chair of the Management Committee of the U.S. Bank. Welcome to both of our witnesses. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record, and members may have 5 days in which to submit statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record. Gentlemen, please feel free to summarize your statements, and we will begin with Dr. Shah.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman, Chairman Emeritus Ross-Leighton. We appreciate your leadership and your guidance over the past several years as we've conducted our reforms and improved our performance. I also want to take this moment to thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for their leadership and support, and Representatives Sherman, Smith, and others, Cicilline and Berra, who've made important opening comments. I want to thank you for the continued partnership to ensure that America has the capacity to effectively project its values around the world through our development and humanitarian activities, and to do so in a manner that advances our national interests while delivering real results. We believe this is an important moment for development. We're drawing down from a decade of war and have the ability to rethink and reimagine how America projects itself and its values around the world. President Obama and Secretary Kerry, like Secretary Clinton before him, have repeatedly commented on the importance of elevating development as part of our national security strategy and as part of our foreign policy, including as part of our economic competitiveness strategy. I note that perhaps the most significant moment I've had in this role was an opportunity to visit a refugee camp in Dadaab, Kenya, on the border of Somalia during last year's tragic famine. In that context, I had the opportunity to meet women who had been through extraordinary challenges in efforts to bring their literally starving children to safety. Some made it, some were able to bring their children, others were not. But in that context, I had the chance to see firsthand that when they walked through the camp and got into a place that was safe, it was American humanitarian effort and American development partnerships that in fact gave them hope. And as tragic as that moment was, just a few months ago I had a chance to visit Mogadishu, and I got a chance to see the other side of the hope that is taking fruit there. I noted that the day before my visit, USAID had worked with the local partners to install more than 600 solar streetlights, and for the first time in 2 decades, people were able to come out peacefully and celebrate in the evenings. We're replacing piracy on the coast with small-scale fishing infrastructure and helping people leave IDP and refugee camps to go back to their communities, supporting the revitalization of their own agriculture in more than 400 communities in that country. That path from dependency to self-sufficiency and ultimately dignity and growth is what our aid and assistance should be about. And I hope we get to discuss today whether this approach is delivering results. We believe it is. Our signature Feed the Future program, which started when we cut back on agricultural investments in 23 countries to focus on 19, where we thought we could make the biggest impact, has reached more than 7 million farm households and is helping to reduce stunting, as Chairman Smith noted, in more than 12 million children who previously lacked effective nutrition. In our Feed the Future countries, we're seeing extreme poverty being reduced at an average annual rate of 5.6%, significantly higher than in counterpart nations. We're working with the private sector to motivate $3.5 billion of private investment to be complementary to our own investments, including having raised more than $500 million through the Development Credit Authority to this purpose. And we're implementing real policy reforms along the way. This is just one example of how large-scale, modern, results-oriented efforts can work and deliver critical outcomes. It's the result of a reform effort we call USAID Forward, which I'm eager to describe to you in terms of our progress today. Thanks to the support of this committee, we've been able to rebuild our staff, bringing in more than 1,100 Foreign Service officers to USAID over the course of my tenure. We've been able to implement an evaluation policy that's recognized as best in class, and today you can go to the Apple App Store and download an application on your iPad or iPhone and pull down more than 180 high-quality evaluations that describe in an unadulterated, independent manner how our programs are working or not working and what we're learning as we seek to make improvements. We've expanded our investments in local solutions that can at times be less costly and more sustainable in delivering these results. And I'm very eager to discuss with you today our efforts to reform food aid, to bring this approach about efficiency and effectiveness to efforts to reach an additional 4 million children without spending additional resources, and to do a better job of saving lives while renewing the partnership with American agriculture. So I thank you for the chance to be here today and look forward to this dialogue, learning from you, and continuing this important partnership.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaw. Mr. Yohannes?
Thank you, Madam Chairman and members of this committee, for the opportunity to appear today with my friend and colleague, Dr. Shaw, to discuss the fiscal year 2014 budget request. I'd like to summarize my statement and submit the full version for the record.
Objection.
Thank you. The President's request of $898.2 million will allow the Millennium Challenge Corporation to continue advancing prosperity, stability, and American values around the world. MCC does this by reducing poverty through sustainable economic growth. Our partners are rigorously selected countries that have a track record of sound democratic and economic governance. We ask them to prioritize their economic needs and then develop and implement cost-effective solutions that make a measurable difference. We're selective about which investment we make because Americans deserve to see their tax dollars deliver a high rate of return. We sign compacts with our partner countries, spelling out the terms of our assistance. During compact implementation, we monitor and evaluate progress and require that programs be completed in 5 years. We'll stop the flow of development dollars if countries fail to respect human rights or democratic values. Lastly, we measure program effectiveness to see what did and did not work. This is part of our evidence-based approach, and because we are committed to transparency and accountability, we make our findings public. Madam Chairman, MCC is delivering real achievements for the world's poor. Transportation networks are stimulating trade with regional impact. Projects in land security, food security, energy security, and water security are connecting the poor to economic growth and opportunity. And MCC-inspired reforms are empowering women, advancing civil rights, and promoting democratic principles. Your constituencies are also benefiting as policy reforms and targeted investment foster and enabling an environment for American businesses to succeed. Last fall, MCC released the first set of independent impact evaluations. This used rigorous statistical methods to measure changes in farm and household incomes of project participants. In El Salvador, for example, evaluators found that dairy farmers doubled their farm incomes. In Ghana, the annual crop income of farmers in the northern region increased significantly relative to the control group, over and above any impacts recorded in other zones. Even when the findings are not all positive, this helps us improve the design and evaluation of future projects as we continue to learn and hold ourselves and our partners accountable. In December of 2012, MCC's board of directors selected 5 countries as eligible to develop a compact: Liberia, Morocco, Niger, Sierra Leone, and Tanzania. Our request also includes funding for threshold programs with Guatemala and Nepal to help them reform policies and institutions that will move them closer to qualifying for compacts. The 5 newly eligible countries are home to over 100 million of the world's poorest people. They represent an opportunity to reduce poverty and advance U.S. interests. These countries have taken concrete steps to reform, improve governance, and qualify for MCC compacts. This is what many call the MCC effect. In fact, a recent study of government officials in developing countries worldwide ranked the influence of MCC's policy performance scorecards greater than any other external measurement system. MCC's modest request for fiscal year 2014 would not allow us to fund compacts with all 5 countries, so some would have to compete for future funding. It is important to note, however, that the MCC effect depends on having sufficient resources to incentivize and sustain policy changes. If our funding is cut, that effect is diminished. Madam Chairman, with the committee's support, MCC and our partner agencies will continue to play a key role in fighting global poverty. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you to both gentlemen for excellent testimony, and I thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for calling this important and timely hearing. Once again, we are having this hearing amidst the backdrop of economic uncertainty, both here and abroad. But here it is incumbent upon us to be responsible stewards of the tax dollars of hardworking Americans. We want to ensure that these hard-earned dollars are spent wisely and strategically while advancing our national security interests and addressing our foreign policy priorities. Which brings me to the administration's request of $370 million for West Bank and Gaza assistance. With Prime Minister Fayyad's resignation casting a greater shadow in the future makeup of the PA, and with the knowledge that corruption is rampant within that body, Dr. Shah, do you believe that the PA possesses adequate internal controls to effectively deliver any U.S. aid? And what assurances have we received that no money will be diverted to Hamas and other terrorist organizations? In addition, Dr. Shah, I continue to be concerned over the administration's attempts to cut much-needed democracy programs to the Cuban people. 40 pro-democracy activists remain on hunger strikes in Cuba to call attention to the dozens of Cubans who are being detained by Castro's state security forces. These brave heroes are risking their lives, yet we are cutting their support, which is not prudent, especially at a time when the crackdown by Castro's thugs is actually on the rise on the island. And Mr. Johannes, with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, we must ensure that the founding principles of the MCC continue to be upheld and do not fall under the trap of providing more and more assistance without an end in sight. Instead, we've got to focus our efforts on economic growth and the graduation of countries away from being dependent on our assistance. As chairman of the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa, I note that the MCC compact with Jordan is coming to an end this year, and I wanted to know if you would comment on that. We will be meeting with the leaders of Jordan later today. Also, Morocco continues to be an important ally to the United States and is a strategic partner in the region. We must further seek ways to reiterate the strong bonds that tie our two nations and promote our shared values and vision for stability in that region. With that in mind, and shifting to another region, Mr. Johannes, I'm concerned about the MCC's attempt to seek a second compact with El Salvador. American investors continue to have problems accessing their assets. There is a lack of public-private partnerships, and endemic corruption issues are still prevalent in El Salvador. According to reports, the current presidential candidate for the FMLN celebrated the terrorist attack on 9/11 and burned an American flag. So I believe that the MCC compact should not be used as a political tool as presidential elections draw near. So I would urge the MCC to wait until after the elections before proceeding with that compact. So, Dr. Shah, if you could address the PA assistance issue and the Cuba issue.
Certainly, thank you, and thank you for your strong leadership on the range of issues here. On West Bank, Gaza, the goals of our effort there are very specific. They're about creating economic opportunities to underpin a peace process, to support basic social services, and we've been able to reach more than 200,000 people with food and more than 75,000 connected to improved water systems, and some core humanitarian priorities as needs arise. We do have very strict controls in how any specific transfers to the Palestinian Authority are conducted, and we're confident that that will continue to go forward as we have run it in the past. Very strict.
Thank you. And on Cuba?
Vetting. And on Cuba, we expect, again, the goals there are support for civil society and democracy with some small humanitarian efforts. And we have worked closely with our partners. We believe the President's budget of $15 million reflects an appropriate investment that they have the capacity to implement. We recognize and take some faith in the fact that GAO reviewed our approach to implementing this program and very strongly commented on the effective reforms we put in place to have a clear and compelling implementation strategy for this effort.
Thank you. And Mr. Johannes, I have not left you much time for Morocco, Jordan, and El Salvador, but maybe you could reply in writing. I don't wish to rush those answers because they are important. Thank you very much. Pleased to yield 5 minutes to our substitute ranking member for the substitute chair, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you, and thank you, Chairman Emeritus, for your questions, particularly regard to the Palestinian Authority and democracy in Cuba. I want to associate myself with your concerns. NGOs just are there to try to provide relief or development. our USAID focuses also on our foreign policy objectives. Minister Shaw, how do you coordinate with the State Department to get to have our foreign policy and national security objectives affect what you do?
Well, thank you, Representative Sherman. I guess I'll offer a general point and a specific one. In terms of coordination, I think under the Obama administration, under Secretary Clinton, and now under Secretary Kerry, it has been both very transparent and much improved. We develop country assistance strategies for each country. They're carefully vetted through USAID and state. We jointly approach the priorities and define them in a specific way, and then measure results and make those outcomes as public and transparent as possible. We have implemented a foreign assistance dashboard that has excellent data from USAID, from state, and from MCC that meets our International Aid Transparency Initiative commitments, and I believe that has been very strong coordination. One important example of that, I think, that speaks to your opening comment is Syria. We have worked hand in glove to make sure that we provide now nearly $400 million of humanitarian support inside of Syria. 65% of that reaches opposition-controlled areas. We're reaching 2.4 million people with critical services and doing that in very close coordination.
Administrator, I'm going to have to go on to a few other things and ask you to supplement your answer for the record, although the fact that the flag is not on the bag in Syria is of great concern to me. I'd like you to for the record, describe what regulations or policies you have for your people in the field that as to when they must emphasize that the aid is coming from the United States, literally put a big flag on the bag of food, et cetera, and when they're allowed to depart from those policies. I'd also like you to provide for the record some case studies or examples to illustrate what is the difference in cost between a local sourcing on the one hand and U.S. sourcing, U.S. flag carrier delivery on the other. I'm sure that there'll be a wide variation in the differences in cost depending upon where the aid's going. As to Pakistan, we provide $2.8 billion in non-military assistance since 2009. The Islamabad government has its own objectives, but we need to win over all the people of Pakistan, and I've focused my attention on the Sindh province. To what degree does Islamabad determine where our aid is focused within Pakistan? And then in writing, maybe you could provide a description of what we're doing in the Sindh province. But who picks the projects and the locations, you or the Pakistani government?
Great. Thank you. Let me just say, with respect to Pakistan first, and Sindh in particular, we have very important partnerships. We design them together. We absolutely retain the capacity and authority to both select projects and oversee their implementation. One example is we made a commitment to help them produce 1,200 megawatts of energy. We've already seen through and successfully produced 800 megawatts, and that's been seen as a tremendous success. Second, we've invested quite a lot of effort in a comprehensive branding strategy for anywhere in the world. Pakistan, I think, is a good example where, as a result of our efforts, we are now we have data that shows that with the awareness of American assistance efforts in Pakistan has gone up threefold. There have been more than 4,000 locally placed.
I'm going to try to sneak in one more question, but please give us that analysis of what's going on in Sindh. I'm somewhat concerned that the administration request cuts aid to Armenia. I think you ought to increase that instead. And if you're looking for a source of funds, you could look at U.S. aid of all types to Azerbaijan, which is thwarting our development efforts for the area by threatening to shoot down civilian aircraft that go into Stepanagart's new airport. I've talked to Mr. Yohannes about the Javaheti region of Georgia. We provide very substantial aid to Georgia, and I hope, as I've discussed with him, and now I have a chance to discuss with you, that a significant part of our aid would go to that otherwise neglected region. And I'll ask, if I've got a chance, Mr. Yohannes, to describe what is the status of our second compact with Georgia, and will Java Hedi be a strong focus if that compact is concluded?
The investment proposal is proceeding extremely well and should be presented to the board sometime in June of this year. And Mr. Congressman, please know that there's some funding that's set aside for Armenian language and also for a number of schools in that region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. 5 minutes and so many questions to ask, and I will submit a number of them for the record. But let me just ask you, Dr. Shah, 2 days ago, Dr. Frieden testified before my subcommittee. Of course, you work very closely with CDC, and he does head up that very important agency. We focused on superbugs and the parasites that increasingly, as well as antimicrobial resistance, and how this is becoming more and more of a problem. I would just ask you if you could to speak to the issue of tuberculosis. You know, MDR and XDR-TB is becoming it always has been, but even more of a problem. I know it's probably OMB, but there is a cut of $45 million in the budget. Hopefully that can be restored and maybe even enhanced because it is so important. And on the issue of malaria, we've had a great discussion, disturbing discussion, that artemisinin resistance in Southeast Asia portends a very dangerous possibility of that expanding into Africa. And we also know that bed nets and all the rest of the efforts that have been Herculean in combating malaria need to be renewed, new bed nets provided. There are 104 malaria endemic countries. You might want to speak briefly to that, and more so for the record. Secondly, before you came out, we talked about the issue of child survival and the vital importance of ORT, 1,000 days, immunizations, all the important things to save lives. You had indicated you had just been in India, and you might want to speak to the issue. A new documentary film was released yesterday. It's entitled, "It's a Girl, the 3 Most Dangerous Words in the World." It notes that a UN figure that there's 200 million missing girls on the planet, directly attributable to sex selection, abortion, and to a lesser extent, infanticide. China and India are the 2 most egregious violators. These are gender crimes. Extermination of a girl child in the womb or at birth has not only in and of itself led to this destruction of girls, but it led to more sex trafficking, and that has skyrocketed in India and in China in particular. But you did talk about the nexus with child survival and that some of the health ministers, if you could speak to that very quickly.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and thank you for your strong leadership on these issues for decades, and child survival in particular. With respect to child survival, last year we pulled together partner countries from around the world to get everyone to make a commitment to end preventable child death worldwide. The United States signed the pledge, as did others, and today there are more than 150 countries producing data-driven report cards and scorecards tracking progress. There are about 7 million children under the age of 5 who die every year. As the President noted in the State of the Union address, we're committed to taking that down to as close to 0 as possible within 2 decades. In India in particular, I think is a good example of this public-private partnership model of work coming together. We have private companies making investments to track data and report on outcomes. We have private companies expanding zinc mining precisely to create zinc syrups and other products that can be helpful to children who would die otherwise of diarrhea. And we know that these efforts are generating results, as these ministers came together to brief me on their progress, but also to describe how it is correlated with the sex selection problem to which you speak, and how that needs to be incorporated into the approach. I'll say very briefly with respect to tuberculosis. Let me just say on that, though, I think the most amazing thing is we're not driving this process through big new investments of American taxpayer dollars. It's really American leadership and a focus on science and technology and measurement and results that is allowing us to partner with others to achieve that kind of an outcome. With respect to tuberculosis, I appreciate your comments, and we are very focused on multi-drug resistant and also XDR-TB, which I'm sure Tom Friedman spoke about. He's one of the world's experts on that for many decades now. There are 3 foreign assistance accounts that provide our tuberculosis support. So while we limited some of our funding in one account, we're expanding our efforts in HIV-related TB and in using the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria to make sure that our investments crowd in resources from other donors and allow for more sustainability over time. And finally, to your point on malaria, I think this, with your strong leadership, has been one of the big success stories America can take great pride in. Independent evaluations by Boston University and others have shown that there are, as a result of this annual investment we make of less than $700 million, as many as 200,000 children under the age of 5 who don't die every year in sub-Saharan Africa because we have an evidence-based, clearly measured, targeted approach, and it serves as the basis for our efforts to further reduce preventable child death in that region. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you so much, Mr. Smith. Mr. Kennedy is recognized. Sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm so sorry. I'm out of touch. Mr. Cicilline.
I appreciate the thought.
I would have yielded to Mr. Kennedy, of course.
Mr. Cicilline is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure whether the proper way to address you is an ambassador, administrator, or doctor. I'm not sure which of those is best, but I think ambassador is what I'll use. I want to first thank you for your great leadership at USAID. And the issue that I'd like to hear a little more about is, we have seen, and I've certainly learned about the decline in personnel at USAID over the last 20 years or so, and kind of the breaking up of some of the functions with different agencies within the government, and the ongoing use of contracting services. And the impact that that has had, I think, has been detrimental to our development and aid efforts around the world. And I think you have recognized that in your Forward AID initiative. And so I'd like you to sort of talk a little bit about what is the end goal of that, where you are in the implementation of that, and whether or not there are things that we can do on the legislative side to protect that kind of rebuilding of both the budgeting, policy, and personnel capacities of USAID, which I think is reflective in some of the questions that people are asking about people understanding what role we are playing in aid and development around the world. So I'll stop there and go first to that question.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your leadership and that accurate reflection of the situation that emerged over 15 years. Between 1990 and 2005, our staffing was reduced by more than 40%. The policy and budget activities ceased to exist, and the agency did engage, in my view, in quite a lot of no-bid contracting with very little oversight, often in war zones where that can lead to all kinds of unintended consequences. So in response to that, we launched USAID Forward, and it was basically an Obama administration effort to help USAID rebuild as America's premier development and humanitarian entity. And with your and the Congress's strong support, we've been able to hire in 1,100 new officers into the agency during my tenure. Those officers have helped us fill a 40% staffing gap in Africa. We have, in fact, cut a large number, going from almost 800 down to 520 specific programs around the world so we could focus our efforts in those places where we deliver the best results. We've reshaped and repositioned our staff, closing more than 14 missions around the world in order to advance the focus and selectivity we think is critical to delivering results. USAID Forward has three major components. A partnership component that says we should be working efficiently and effectively with partners that can create the conditions where our aid is no longer needed. And we released a detailed report about a month and a half ago that shows we've, in a thoughtful and rigorous way, been able to expand our engagements with local partners by more than 50% over the last few years. We have a focus on innovation and science and technology. Last year, we opened in partnership with 7 American universities, development innovation laboratories. Those laboratories are producing new technologies and insights like a cell scope that Chairman Smith would be interested in, I'm sure, but it takes an iPhone and connects it to a plastic microscope, allows you to take essentially a photograph of a blood smear and then runs a software algorithm to diagnose malaria and hopefully someday tuberculosis. Taking laboratory diagnostics out of treatment and care and the context where we work would be a major cost reducer and would allow us to add to the list of success stories in terms of serious disease reductions in difficult parts of the world. And finally, and most importantly, this has been an effort that really attempts to focus on delivering real results. So today you can, as I noted, download an application that would show you all of the evaluation data that we put forward. We actually produce annual reports on our Feed the Future program, on our child survival efforts, on our malaria program that just came out a few days ago. And we think it's important to be transparent with the American people because the capacity to support this work, I think, is much stronger when people see clear, direct results, and they are now able to do that.
Thank you. I'm also very pleased that this budget reflects the administration's commitment to political, economic, social, and cultural equality for women and girls. And I'd just ask you, maybe in written response, to tell us a little more about the progress that you're making with respect to those issues, and particularly how investing in gender equality is helping to reduce poverty and create development opportunities around the world, and particularly interested in learning more about our efforts to reduce violence against women all over the world. And I know that that is work that's ongoing, and would like to hear more about that in a written response. And just in my last 7 seconds, I want to say to Ms. Johannes, thank you for the second Millennium Compact for Cape Verde, which is helping the country improve water delivery and sanitation. I know very well the great success that they're having in Cape Verde, and thank you again for your leadership in that area. And I yield back the negative 10 seconds I have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Shabbat of Ohio is recognized. He is the chair of our Asia Subcommittee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Sherman has already raised the issue, but I want to emphasize something that he said, and that's the fact that the U.S. is the most generous country on earth by far in providing aid around the world. And I find it particularly annoying that we oftentimes have to hide the source of that aid, which is the American taxpayer, because we might offend some people who, let's face it, hate America. We should proudly and prominently display and, in fact, trumpet the generosity and the goodness of the American people. And if this offends someone and they turn the aid down, fine. We'll give it to somebody else who would appreciate it. Now, as chair of the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee, I had a couple questions, one on Indonesia, one on China, and one on Vietnam. Mr. Johannes, I believe the Millennium Challenge account, the Sustainability Economic Growth Mission, is how all of our foreign assistance should be modeled, because in a number of cases it's proven to be far more successful than many of the foreign assistance programs administered through USAID. Now, on Indonesia, in 2006, Indonesia was named eligible for the MCC Threshold Program, which seeks to reduce corruption by bolstering several key anti-corruption institutions, including the Supreme Court and the Anti-Corruption Commission. Last year, Indonesia's ranking on the Corruption Perceptions Index, unfortunately, fell from 100 in 2011 to 118 out of 176 countries polled. Relative to other countries polled, Indonesia remains in the, quote, cluster of countries with significant corruption problems, unquote. Considering the MCC has been in Indonesia for a few years now, could you discuss how the MCC has helped fight corruption and some of the challenges you are confronting in meeting your program goals? And I also understand that in this particular case, Indonesia has been a reluctant partner in implementation, which questions the sustainability of the programs once the MCC leaves. Can you discuss this particular issue and how MCC is working to address the problem? Thank you.
Corruption is a major obstacle to economic growth, and we have absolutely zero tolerance for corruption. Having said that, all of the countries, including Indonesia, were selected because they passed our corruption indicators. And we'll look in terms of to see if, in fact, corruption is institutionalized. We know that despite their efforts to cut down on corruption, corruption exists, not only in Indonesia and a lot of our partner countries. We also know that corruption exists in developed countries. But we look in terms of, is it institutionalized? Do they honor contract? Do they abide by the rule of law? Are the judges independent from the, from executive branch of government? Are they creating the best environments for businesses to succeed? We look for trends to make sure that they are creating a very friendly environment for businesses to succeed. Part of our $600 million compact is to help the country to fight corruption, primarily by helping for open procurement opportunities in their countries. In fact, they had to do a special decree to set an MCC affiliate in that country because previously all aids were funded directly through the government. We don't give not even a dime directly to the government. In fact, after the president decreed this new MCA entity, it had to be approved. This is the first time it was ever done in that country.
Thank you. Let me cut you off there just because I've got two other quick questions I'd like to present to Administrator Shaw. One is on China. USAID has requested $4.5 million in economic support funds for China. Right now, they own an estimated $1.7 trillion of U.S. debt, and they hold over $3.25 trillion in foreign cash reserves. How do you justify that, particularly when we have a $16.8 trillion debt? And then finally, relative to Vietnam, we had a staff Codell over there last month. Their human rights record, unfortunately, is not good, and unfortunately, many would argue getting worse. It's been requested an $18 million increase over the past year. How do you justify that? And you've got 15 seconds to answer both questions. So.
Thank you. With respect to China, we don't provide any support to the government of China. The $4.5 million is specifically to help Tibetan communities improve livelihoods, promote sustainable development, and preserve cultural traditions. And there's absolutely no correlation or flow to the Chinese government whatsoever. With respect to Vietnam, I would note that compared to the FY12 proposal real number, the FY14 request is an overall 12% reduction in our investment there, and our focus there is to maintain our support for the PEPFAR HIV/AIDS effort, as well as to support civil society, and in particular people with disabilities, in addition to the dioxin remediation activities that have been an ongoing commitment of the United States.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go now to Mr. Elliott Engel, our ranking member on the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like unanimous consent to insert my statement into the record, but I want to just talk about some of the things. You know, in this difficult fiscal environment, some reflectively turn to the foreign assistance budget as the first place to make cuts, and I think that's regrettable. I really wanted to say that because I think it's important. I want to commend the administration for its food aid reform proposal. Our current food aid programs waste millions of taxpayers' dollars and often harm agricultural markets in the countries we're trying to help. Secretary of Agriculture has said this reform initiative will have little or no effect on American farmers. So I would like to, after I say a few more words, I'd like to ask Dr. Shah to comment on the administration's plans to restructure our food aid programs to make them more efficient and affordable. I want to say, in terms of global health, I was pleased to see the small overseas increase in funding for global health programs at USAID, especially for PEPFAR. I think that's very, very important. And Mr. Yohannes, I think it's a testament to MCC that many of the reforms being pursued by USAID and the State Department are based in large part on the MCC model. I think that's very, very good. But I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on how MCC can address my longstanding concern about how we work with countries that lack data on their respective scorecards. As you know, I've been very disappointed in MCC's handling of Kosovo, a country recognized by the United States, but not a member of the UN, because of MCC's dependency on UN agencies for much of the data it uses. Kosovo was left with multiple empty, failed boxes on its scorecard, essentially keeping it from competing for a compact or threshold program. I thought this was very unfair to Europe's newest country, and while I recognize MCC's willingness to accept supplementary data, it's unclear at best how MCC uses this information to calculate a country's scores, and unlike the rest of MCC's process, there is nothing transparent about this approach. So I really hope MCC addresses this problem so in the future countries in Kosovo's position will be evaluated and able to compete the same way as all other countries. And the last point before I ask both of you to answer the questions is that Congress has been appropriating unprecedented sums for the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority for the past several years. This is important for maintaining a semblance of stability in the West Bank and in Israeli-Palestinian relations. as well as for humanitarian reasons. But it's no coincidence that this increase in U.S. assistance has occurred during Salam Fayyad's tenure as Prime Minister, a man who won great respect for his emphasis on budget transparency and other aspects of good governance. Fayyad, unfortunately, in my opinion, resigned last week, and we anticipate a replacement will be named soon. And I wanted to take this opportunity to urge President Abbas of the Palestinians in considering Fayyad's replacement to appoint someone who will continue the positive aspects of Fayyad's approach. Without continuing budget transparency, further U.S. assistance for the Palestinian Authority will not be possible. So I'm wondering, first, Dr. Shah, we have met many times, and you know I'm an admirer of yours. I support the administration's, like Chairman Royce, I support the administration's plans to restructure our food aid programs to make them more efficient and affordable. So could you elaborate for us the potential taxpayer savings this plan will generate? Do you believe it will have any impact on American farm income? And has DOD signaled their concerns about the proposal in regard to its impact on military readiness and deployment capacity?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and thank you for your leadership across the range of these issues and for the extra efforts you've put in to help us do our work better and more effectively. With respect to the food reform proposal, it is geared around the absolute intention to reach 4 million additional children without spending additional resources. We recognize these are very difficult budget times, and the FY14 request is actually in total 6% lower than the FY12 request. With respect to what's happening right now, why this is urgent, because of the incredible commitment to Syria and Syrian refugees and the food needs in that context, what limited flexibility we have had in this program has been absorbed in that context. As a result, there are many other parts of the world, post-famine Somalia, the DRC, Pakistan, where we're reverting kids from programs that have been supported through the more flexible local and regional procurement program back to the more restrictive Title II program. And in the context of doing that, we're having to reduce services to hundreds of thousands of beneficiaries. We believe we need the flexibility embedded in the proposal and have studied carefully the impact on American agriculture. The truth is, over the last decade, this program has been shriveling up because of the changing cost structure of the effort. We used to ship 5.5 million metric tons. Now we ship 1.8 million metric tons. As Secretary Vilsack has noted, this is less than 1/2% of the total value of U.S. agricultural exports, and we're only proposing a diminishment from 85% to 55% in terms of tied U.S. commodities as part of the program. There have been more than a dozen studies that have validated the efficiency gains of taking this approach in a number of respects, and we believe this will help us renew the partnership between American agriculture and American humanitarian communities to maintain American food security and hunger leadership around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. And if the Chairman will indulge me, Mr. Yohannes, I mentioned that it's really a testament to MCC that many of the reforms being pursued by USAID are doing it in large part on the MCC model because clear metrics and transparent benchmarks should be the hallmark of all our foreign assistance programs. So I commend you for that. I'd like your comments, though, on Kosovo. It's been a longstanding frustration of mine.
Congressman, thank you. When Kosovo became independent in 2008, it presented a different challenge for us. We simply did not have a lot of the indicators from the indicator companies. But since 2008, we worked very closely with all the indicator agencies that provide us with that information. And today, we have more information about Kosovo than we ever had in the past. The only agency that's not providing us information is the United Nations, but we've been able to get supplemental information directly from them. We've been actively engaged. I sent one of my best economists to the country last year, and today they only pass 8 out of the 20 indicators. Having said that, we're working with them very closely to make sure that they understand what needs to be done. And the good news and the bad news, Congressman, is that they have graduated to the higher income bracket in the last 2 years. And if they continue to make that progress, they may not be eligible for our program. But we work with them, and I'll be more than happy to work with you, Congressman, what we need to do in the future in cases like this one.
Well, thank you. I want to work closely with you on that. And finally, before I relinquish, I'd like to just add my voice to Mr. Smith's comments about cutting TB funding by $57 million. It's really extremely short-sighted. And I really think that we have to sufficiently fund our efforts to treat and eliminate tuberculosis. And I just wish you would take that into consideration. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. I wanted to go just for a minute to this issue of food aid reform. And Ambassador Shaw, I'm very encouraged by this reform proposal. It's one that had been made in the prior administration as well, or had been suggested. And I remember talking to Andrew Natsios, about your predecessor in your position, about some of the challenges that he had, and his feeling that both hands were tied behind his back. As he shared with us at one point, when we had a devastating food crisis in Africa and in Asia, he said, food aid often gets there after everyone is dead. He was clearly very, very perturbed by the circumstances and the delays. And one of the things that he said is that people can't eat shipping costs, as he was commenting on the reality of the burdensome way that the system operated. When it takes months for food aid to arrive, or when you have a situation where you've seen the United States dump food into markets that undermine local production and drive the population into deeper poverty, it really gives you pause in terms of our current method of operation. When I chaired the Africa Subcommittee, we had the president of Mali here. This was about a decade probably ago. And he testified how it was undermining his farmers and how it was undermining, how agricultural subsidies were undermining his society. You know, there's a negative impact on our Western agricultural subsidies that it has on African farmers, and we need to be responsible here. And the framework for your proposal, I think, has been found to save time, money, certainly lives, and I think it promises to reduce the deficit going forward over the next 10 years by about $500 million. So I was going to ask you a question, and this goes to the issue of aid to refugees from Syria. I understand that the requirement of a U.S. ship recently delayed a food shipment to Syria, and I was going to ask you about that, Mr. Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your very strong and effective leadership on this topic in particular. You know, the Syria crisis has, in fact, precipitated an urgency around the need for this reform, both because in opposition-controlled parts of Syria, traditional food convoys would be targeted. We've had more than 150 deaths across humanitarian workers in that context. And because as we've used what limited flexibility we have in and around Syria, and it's been effective in that context, we have eliminated our capacity to use that same flexibility in places like Somalia and the DRC. So all of the basic points you've made, I think, are the core rationale for this effort. We know that we can get a 30 to 50% cost reduction on actual product purchases. We know there's an 11 to 14-week shipping delay in pursuing the traditional model. We know that shipping costs have increased by a factor of more than 3 over the last decade, which is in part why the metric tons of food that we buy and ship have fallen from 5.5 million metric tons to 1.8 million metric tons. And as a result, American leadership on this issue around the world has also fallen. Today we service less than half of the beneficiaries we did when President Bush and Andrew Natsios made this proposal, a version of this proposal 10 years ago. I also want to validate and highlight the challenges of the practice of monetizing food assistance. When we try to support a wonderful partner like CARE or World Vision or Catholic Relief Services in the Democratic Republic of Congo by shipping food from here to there, giving them the food, asking them to sell it in precisely the markets where they're then turning around and using the cash to help farmers produce value. They both create strong disincentives and, frankly, lose 50% of the value in that case of the resource compared to what we spent buying the food on this end of the world. So there's a strong consensus around a data-driven approach here, and we're trying to put this proposal forward in a way that manages and maintains the important coalitions required to renew American leadership on hunger.
Let me bring up one other issue. I'm deeply concerned about the growing number of land seizures taking place in the Philippines. Property rights are essential to an individual's personal and economic security, but it's also essential in terms of economic growth. And Mr. Shaw, I see the request for development assistance in the Philippines includes an increase up $6.6 million for a total of $87.7 million. Will any of these funds be directed towards securing and protecting property rights? And if not, why not?
It is our intention is to ensure that we work on the range of those types of issues in the context of these programs. I'd have to provide more specific details perhaps in writing.
I'll be in consultation with you afterwards. Mr. Johannes, MCC has $434 million in its compact with the Philippines, and that is nearly 2 years into implementation. And I appreciate your commitment to raising the land seizure issue with the government there. Is this not an issue of commitment to rule of law that's central to your mission?
Chairman, it is very important, the rule of law, and we have communicated our concerns to the government. I think it's also extremely important for economic growth, and I know they are very committed in the fight against corruption, but also they need to do something different on this one, and based on the conversations we've had with them, they understand the problems and they are willing and committed to find solutions for this problem.
Mr. Johannes, thank you for your efforts, and Mr. Shaw, we appreciate it. We're going to go now to Dr. Berra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Shaw and Mr. Johannes for being here. You know, as a doctor, I recognize the important work that USAID does in global health, including seeking to prevent child and maternal death through the transmission of AIDS, particularly in the Global Health Initiative and through their PEPFAR funding. Very important programs that have really relieved human suffering. Obviously, one of the goals of both the MCC and USAID is to help the countries that we're interacting with become self-sufficient. And you know, that is always one of our goals. You know, in my conversations with the government of India and with the state of California, as we're looking at the issue of food security and helping India feed its own population, I was astonished at the amount of food loss that occurs in India. It's upwards to 40% of the food gets lost in a nation where hundreds of millions go to bed hungry every night. A lot of this is around issues of cold storage and issues of lack of infrastructure of taking the food and moving it to market. I'd be interested in hearing from either one of you on some efforts working with the government of India to improve both the storage issue and then the movement issue.
Thank you. And I'll just address a few of those points. I think with respect to food security in India, when President Obama visited during his state visit, he launched a partnership for an evergreen revolution with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. And that partnership was really designed to have both countries partner along technical and other lines, as opposed to having the United States make significant investments in India, because India has plenty of resources in its agricultural sector. As a result of that, three things have happened. One is there's been a much expanded technical exchange across universities, some from California, like Davis, along with partner universities in India, many of which we had a strong role in helping to develop decades ago. Second, the Indian government has tried to pass legislation to allow for American companies like Walmart and others to be involved in essentially professionalizing the food chain and creating and bringing the technologies and logistics capabilities of those companies to address exactly the issues you raised, like cold storage and reducing post-harvest losses. We've been a technical partner in that effort, and between USAID, USDA, and the government of India, that's moving forward. So those types of activities have been very important. The third and final thing I'd note is There are a range of technology partners in India that have joined this effort and are now actually partnering with the United States, investing their own resources in tackling hunger in sub-Saharan Africa through our Feed the Future partnership. And we think that is emblematic of a new model where India plays a larger role, bringing some of its technology and businesses to partner with us on this challenge in sub-Saharan Africa.
Great. Mr. Yohannes, would you like to?
About 40% of MCC's investments are tied primarily to help many of our partner countries to become food secure. So, for example, in agriculture, we're not only training farmers how to become self-sufficient, but also providing them with a lot of opportunities. We're building roads around the community so they have access to markets. We're building cold storage facilities so the fruits that have been produced by those farmers are not spoiled until they ship to overseas. And last year, we just completed 5 impact evaluations with 5 of our countries as it relates to farmer training. And we are seeing great results. You know, in the past, most development agencies measure the outputs and the outcomes as the result of farmer training. But what we're learning is we've taken it one step further, and for example, in El Salvador, the dairy farmers doubled their income as a result of our investment. In Nicaragua, they increased their income by 30%. In Ghana, they increased the income significantly by 40–50%. And what we're doing next is, we know it's very difficult to do, is to see if our investments are increasing household incomes, which is very difficult to do, but we're going to know more in the next 2–3 years. But we're seeing great results from our investment with the farmer program.
Well, great. Well, Dr. Shah, Mr. Yohannes, I think that's exactly what we should be doing, right? As we help people become, and countries become more self-sufficient, obviously we help stabilize their governments and we help promote our democratic values. It also is good business sense. Dr. Shah, as you pointed out, we have technologies, the university-to-university partnerships that are occurring with my home institution at UC Davis, as well as with our entrepreneurs and innovators. Certainly we can take what we're doing here and export that and help other countries. So I look forward to working with both of you. And I yield back.
We'll go now to Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before we can have an honest discussion about this, people need to face the reality of what our fundamentals are right here in the United States. We're going, Dr. Shaw, do you know what the proposed level of deficit spending is by the administration in their budget? Not foreign aid, but the overall. No, you don't. And Mr. Yohannes, do you know? Well, it's at least we are going to expend at least expend $1 billion more than we're taking in, and we've been doing this for 5 years. If that is not corrected within a very short period of time, we won't be able to do any of these noble things that you're talking about. So whenever we are, in order to do our responsibility here, we need to be confronting that basic truth. And so how do we do that? Yes, it's $1 trillion, not $1 billion, excuse me. $1 trillion, billion. So before every expenditure that we're talking about, we need to put in front of this, is this worth the United States borrowing this money from China in order to expend it wherever we're going to do it? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about borrowing money from a foreign power, probably China or Japan, in order to give it to someone else. And if we can't honestly answer that, we should not be doing that project. That's for sure. I personally believe that we need to restructure aid considering this so that our aid is no longer developmental aid. And Mr. Yohannes is doing a great job in that he's insisting on, with his organization, changes in the fundamental status quo that has created the hardship in those countries, rather than just giving aid, which will then not do any good at all, because if you're not changing the status quo and the way you do things, it'll go right back to what it was. But we need to basically restructure our whole concept into developmental aid is no longer our responsibility because we can't afford it, because we're having to borrowing from someone else in order to help another country develop is not right, and that our aid should be basically emergency humanitarian aid in cases of natural disasters. That's what we can afford, and that's it. Maybe that's worth borrowing from another country in order to save people who are in a desperate situation. Otherwise, we're going to put our own people in a desperate situation. Now, a couple questions on specifics about your request this year. Dr. Shaw, you visited China last week, and we were involved in a new working group on climate change that was announced that the U.S. is going to cooperate in developing these new technology, clean technology projects. We've been giving China, we've been borrowing money in order to give to China for these technologies. Is that over, or does your announcement mean we're going to continue giving aid to China, that we are actually borrowing from China?
Thank you, Congressman. Just to clarify, sir, I was not in China, and I'm certainly not a part of that working group. But yeah, but I'd also highlight that our request with respect to China is solely focused on Tibetan communities, and it's the 4.5 million.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a good answer. Let me just announce right here that we should not be giving aid to countries that are hostile to the United States or have can be seen that their governments have committed actions that have supported international terrorism. That's why, Mr. Chairman, I would announce today that I plan to offer an amendment to whatever foreign aid bill comes to the floor that suggests that Pakistan should get not 1 penny of support for anything until Dr. Afridi, the man who helped us bring to justice Osama bin Laden, is freed from a Pakistani dungeon. The American people need to be outraged that Pakistan is holding Dr. Afridi in the first place after giving safe haven to Osama bin Laden, the murderer of 3,000 of our citizens. But for us then to give them aid on top of that is absolutely unconscionable. And so, Mr. Chairman, I will be offering an amendment until Dr. Afridi is freed. We shouldn't even consider giving them 1 penny. There are other countries that are hostile to us. We should not be giving money to those countries while their governments are hostile to the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Now we go to Ms. Lois Frankel from Florida.
Thank you very much. I want to just, first of all, thank you to the panel for being here. I want to preface my remarks first by saying that I do believe that foreign aid has a good purpose when it's spent correctly. And so with that said, I do want to talk to you about Afghanistan, because from what I have read and what I have heard is that much of the aid that we have given there, and I'm not even talking about military now, has just been very wasteful. It's lined the pockets of bad actors. It's been used for bribery. It's made folks there more reliant on the United States and less reliant on themselves. So in that regard, I would like you to comment on that, but I want to ask you some questions to go along with your that you could also comment on. Who is in charge of development in the world? And you can use Afghanistan as an example. Is it the military who seems to be doing similar functions as USAID? Is it the State Department? What do you measure your outputs? If you build a school, do you actually determine whether anybody's getting educated? And how would you avoid the kind of waste that we've heard about in Afghanistan in the future?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you for your preface, because foreign aid is less than 1% of our budget, and for that we believe we deliver critical national security results and economic opportunities that sustain American leadership around the world and will for decades. With respect to Afghanistan, I just want to step back for a moment and articulate that I believe the collective development investment in Afghanistan has created some basic conditions that allow our troops to come home and us to aspire for a stable and secure country that's not a terrorist threat to us in the future. We've seen annualized rates of growth of 9 to 10% over the last several years. We've seen a more than tripling of electricity access due to large part because of our specific investments, including helping the Afghan utility company use mobile payments to increase their own generation of revenues by more than 300%. We've helped build 1,900 kilometers of road that has contributed directly to improved economic activity and business investment. And today there are 8 million kids in school, including 3 million girls, when there were 0 girls in school under the Taliban. The fastest and most significant reductions in child death and maternal death during childbirth anywhere in the world over the last decade have been in Afghanistan, have been verified by independent studies that were released last year, and create a basis for some degree of stability as we look ahead. That said, sustaining these gains in the context we're in and fighting corruption are absolutely our priorities. I was on the call earlier this week with General Dunford, and we have a very close, tightly integrated civilian-military plan. And we need to have that kind of tight integration. The military has matched any civilian development investment and far exceeded that investment. So doing it together is critical to being able to deliver these results and being able to fight corruption. We last year brought together the international community to pledge sustained support for Afghanistan, but also to implement what we created as the Tokyo Mutual Accountability Framework. And if Afghanistan does not meet clear criteria on free and fair, transparent elections, on fighting corruption and recovering assets from the Kabul bank crisis, on efforts to protect rights for women and girls, including the 25% quota for women in the parliament, then we will pull back our aid and assistance, and we'll do that in concert with more than a dozen other international partners. And it's that kind of serious, conditional accountability framework that we believe is the best way to make sure that we sustain the gains, allow our troops to come home, and recognize that the 2% of the total Afghanistan investment that is represented by development will ultimately play a much larger percentage impact on whether there's a stable future for that country and a terrorist threat to us.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
We go to Mr. Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Dr. Shaw, after sequestration took place, the administration notified the military that they were going to cut the military tuition assistance program. Congress rectified that in the continuing resolution. Military assistance, our tuition program, as you know, helps military who are currently on active duty to finish their education. It helps them, it helps the military, and of course it helps the state of readiness. But at the same time, after sequestration took place, USAID notified Congress that $41 million would be sent to Pakistan to help pay for scholarships for Pakistani students. So it just seems to me we don't have money to help our own military go to school because of sequestration. After sequestration takes place, we do have the money to help Pakistani kids go to school. And I can tell you this has not set well with a lot of folks. Can you walk me through this decision and why it was made, and if it's we're still going to help those students in Pakistan?
Thank you. Thank you, Representative, and I appreciate your comments and leadership on these issues and on transparency and results reporting in our portfolio of work as well. I'll just say that sequestration has affected U.S. aid and foreign assistance as severely as any other part of the budget, and we're recognizing and feeling that every day. There's been a more than $70 million reduction to our food aid and assistance, a more than $400 million reduction to our economic and development assistance, a nearly $70 million reduction to our operating expenses, and we, like many other parts of the government, are putting in place strict measures to achieve those forced and required savings in the context where 75% of our staff are in international contexts.
Excuse me, Dr. Shaw, I understand sequestration has affected USAID, but zero in specifically on the money we're sending to Pakistan for their students to finish their education. If you could just zero in on why that decision was made.
So I would have to go back and get you a specific answer, but my understanding would be that the FY13 budget has been reduced significantly in Pakistan, in fact, far more than the sequester amount, as well as in many other parts of the world. And I would presume that that was well before maybe FY11 or 12, but let me come back to you on that, sir.
I would appreciate that. As you know, Dr. Shaw, I filed a bill called the Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act. What it does is have us, the government, USAID, foreign aid, evaluated to see if it's actually working. I was surprised to learn until I filed that legislation that generally over the years of foreign assistance, we've never evaluated programs that work and help those, and programs that don't work, they're still not working, but we're still giving them money in some cases because none of this has been evaluated. The legislation did pass the House last year. Senate blocked it, didn't come up for a vote before the end of the year. Could you weigh in on transparency, maybe the bill, maybe not, but the whole concept of Americans sending money to other nations? Americans want to see if the money that we're sending to NGOs and governments, et cetera, is working or not working. Would you just weigh in on that whole concept of transparency and accountability?
Absolutely, sir. It is essential, and I want to congratulate you on your leadership on that and also express our very strong support for the bill, in particular the version that passed in the House. The administration has made the first ever commitment to the International Aid Transparency Initiative, and Daniel and I are leading the charge to ensure that all of our assistance is very transparent in that context. Both of us publish all of our financial data on the Foreign Assistance Dashboard, which is an online website. The MCC this year published a series of very important impact evaluations. We at USAID put more than 180 high-quality evaluations on a site where you can download it on an app and look at the projects. In both cases, the data shows real significant, important results in many cases, and in some cases shows that programs did not work. In our case, we made more than 50% of the programs were adjusted based on the initial evaluation data, and I know the MCC has the same kind of learning approach that allows us to be better and more effective in how we do our work. And so we're all very supportive of this move. This administration has tried to lead in this space, and I think we've used modern technology to help be more transparent than any prior administration ever has on development and humanitarian investments.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. Mr. Yohandes, I was going to have you weigh in on that too, but my time is up, so thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge. We're now going to Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Shaw, Mr. Yohannes, for joining us and sharing with us your experience, insights, and priorities. Let me add the emphasis of the importance of the work you do, the fact that you are focused on mission, the selectivity in deciding where to apply our resources, and the accountability. It's very much appreciated. One of my areas of concern we see in the Middle East, the region is having a lot of challenges, in particular between the Israelis and the Palestinians with the announced resignation of Prime Minister Fayyad, which in many ways is related to the support and aid we give. Moving forward, as Mr. Fayyad moves on or wherever he goes, I'd be interested in your sense of the impact that's going to have in our aid in the region.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question. You know, Secretary Kerry spoke to this specifically and indicated that, you know, we're moving forward with a process that he believes can deliver a positive outcome over time, and our aid and assistance in this region is very tied to that process. Currently, the priorities are building the kind of public-private investment partnerships that can create economic activity and some hopefulness and an alternative path forward for many in the region. We continue to pursue both humanitarian assistance in the West Bank as well as support for the Palestinian Authority. The way we structure that program has very careful partner vetting, so we know who we're giving resources to and who we're not. It has a very specific degree of financial flows that Mr. Fayyad helped put in place with us, where the resources essentially go to Israeli bank and first pay off debts that the Palestinian Authority has with those Israeli banks. So we have a high degree of confidence, but we will be vigilant about making sure that the protections we built with Fayyad continue on. And of course, that will continue to be a condition on our continued assistance there.
What is the plan moving forward with Fayyad moving on? The institutions he had started to build, the frameworks that we're going to provide for potentially a future state, that those continue to get the development support they need in the ways you outlined, holding people accountable.
Absolutely. And in fact, while we do have a lot and have had a lot of confidence in Fayyad specifically, these have been institutional efforts. Every year we go through a very rigorous process to ensure that these institutional checks are in place, that we're building these institutions in a rigorous way, and that we can track and trace our resources. So, it's important that his replacement abides by those principles and stands for those principles. But if they can't, then we won't be able to go forward with what we do. But we have every reason to believe that this focus on building strong, transparent, credible institutions, paying off debts that are accrued, and doing it in a transparent way will continue to be the sort of hallmark of this relationship.
Great, thank you. Shift gears, Mr. Yohannes, I'm going to go to my colleague's former question, because what you're doing with MCC, the emphasis on accountability, help us understand a little more the impact that's having, and looking forward, how we'll make decisions to maintain effectiveness and the high return on the investment you guys are making.
Our approach to development is like a business. We use evidence-based decision-making processes, how we select countries, how we do constraint analysis, how we make investment decisions, primarily invest in those countries that really accept American values, and also it's investment that are expected to have the best return for American taxpayers. And once the investments are made, we have the most rigorous evaluation, monitoring to make sure that the investments are producing the desired results. And we do, in addition to what's been done traditionally by most aid agencies, we go one step further and do a very thorough impact evaluation by independent parties. That tells us if in fact the investments that have been made have increased income. And we've been seeing a lot of successes. We're also seeing what needs to be changed as a result of what we've seen from the independent impact evaluations. I think the most beautiful part of the whole process is we are learning and we're building evidence about what needs to be changed and what's working, what's not working, that informs in terms of how we should design and implement future programs as a result of this rigorous impact evaluations that we're learning. And we hold our partners accountable. All the programs are country-owned. We only have 2 American hires on the ground. They're responsible. They want to replace aid investment with the private sector. We're helping them to put in a path to become self-sufficient. And let me tell you, I was in Tanzania last week, and I saw many of the work that have been completed. Even by American standards, those are very complex projects. But you know what? They are being done on time. And they want to prosper. And we are creating commerce, investment opportunities, because these countries are also creating the investment climate that is very conducive for American companies to invest in those countries. So they are great partners, and they are the future. And investment in those countries also would be able to help here at home for American companies to create more jobs. And they are our future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield.
Tom Marino of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for what you do. You are both extraordinary men. I appreciate that. Doctor, if I could for a moment, as a prosecutor in handling cases, my theory was follow the money. And it always ended up in convictions. Could you explain to the taxpayers how specifically you follow the money to see how it is spent? Because there is a perception out there that we wire millions of dollars over to the government into their account, and then we do not see it anymore.
I very much appreciate both your prosecutorial background and the question, because I think it's very, very important. The United States, when I started, the amount of money we provided to foreign governments was 9% of our total expenditure. That compares to all of our peer organizations around the world, where they are somewhere between 60 and 80% in terms of how they do that. We've since moved up to 14.8%, still orders of magnitude behind other partners, but in a more direct and specific way. When we do that, we do very careful assessments of countries that are receiving resources. Often the assessments will result in us not being able to move forward with partnering directly with a country. But even more importantly, most of the resources we provide are provided on what we call a fixed amount reimbursement agreement, which means countries have to implement a program, invoice the cost they incur, send the invoices in. We do a third-party monitoring of has the activity been conducted effectively, and then pay the bill for it per an initial agreement we may have made. In addition to that, in some difficult-to-work-in settings like Afghanistan or elsewhere, if we do that, we'll also use geospatial monitoring and data and third-party monitoring to further verify that the resources are being shepherded in an effective way. Okay. I'd also point out, because I think there is a misperception, that we provide a lot of direct assistance to the governments of Afghanistan and Pakistan. In Afghanistan, almost the great majority of our investment goes, that is labeled that way, goes to a World Bank trust fund called the Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund, that has been studied by any number of partners, including Harvard and MIT, and found to be very, very effective at both tracing and tracking resources and ensuring that it delivers real results.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Johannes, I know you touched on that a little bit. Do you care to elaborate on that, please, for me?
A couple things. Number one, we don't transfer a single dime to the government directly, and all payments are made directly to the vendors. We have international procurement agents, we have international fiscal agents, and we pay the vendors after all the projects have been completed. We are very careful with American taxpayers. We don't even want to spend not even a dime on corruption or on corruption practices. So we do have a workshop that we teach to a lot of our affiliates how to detect fraud and corruption. And we have an open line, anonymous line, that comes directly to the IG if, in fact, they smell some kind of corruption. But we have control after control to make sure that American taxpayers' funds are not spent on corruption or corrupt practices.
And Mr. Johannes, I believe I read, or through a conversation learned, that you have a process whereby you inform the respective countries or entities that there's a time period by which the proceeds or the aid may stop because there's not improvement and because there's not an initiative on the part of the government. Would you explain that a little bit, please? Well, then, Doctor, if I have time, I'm going to ask you to touch on that, please.
Yes, we hold our partners accountable. I mean, a lot of the commitments are made for 5 years. And if they don't get it done within 5 years, then definitely they lose the funding. But during that 5 years, we expect the partners to, A, continue to commit to good economic governance, continue to be committed to democratic governance. And there's some cases, for example, in Malawi, about a year and a half ago, they did not abide by the same commitment that helped them to qualify for a compact. And the project was suspended.
Good.
And after the new president came in, and she complied with many of our requests, including the requests from her constituencies, the board lifted and reinstated the suspension.
All right, thank you. I'm going to move on to the doctor. Do you have USAID have such a program?
Absolutely. We've actually increased suspensions and debarments of partners of all kinds by more than 5-fold relative to the prior administration. We've been very, very focused on accountability in that context. And in fact, just this past weekend, we pulled together all of the international partners for Afghanistan to use the Afghan accountability framework to make joint judgments about should we be continuing to invest or pulling back some resources if the Afghans do or don't do a certain number of things. And we think that's a hallmark of good aid effectiveness.
Thank you, gentlemen.
We'll go to Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Shah and Mr. Johannes, thanks for being with us today and answering all these questions. Dr. Shah, I want to thank USAID and state as well for the vital and often underappreciated role of providing humanitarian relief to the Syrian people. I agree that the administration focused on helping those in need and protecting our aid workers. Obviously, and you've heard here today, the concern about extremist organizations is growing, and there is some frustration that despite our efforts, we still hear that the Syrian people don't always feel that the U.S. is with them. I would point out the article that sparked much of this debate included some other important details that haven't been getting that much attention. The feeding of 210,000 people a day by flour purchased by the United States, which has helped resolve the acute shortage of bread. Extra food rations have been distributed to more than 400,000 people. 168,000 people sleep under U.S.-provided blankets. 144 field hospitals funded by the United States. This is all something we should be proud of. It's the right thing to do. Can you tell us how you're working to strengthen our relationship and enhance our reputation with the Syrian people?
Thank you. Thank you very much for asking that question and referencing that data and information, which I think is critical. You know, we're addressing those needs in three primary ways. First, we do try to brand and make visible our humanitarian assistance wherever possible. In fact, in this context, and one thing the article did not capture, is we've actually worked with the Syrian Opposition Council to create television content and radio content that we use and communicate throughout opposition-controlled areas, highlighting the efforts. We're not at all concerned about highlighting the extent to which America is providing this assistance. In fact, we're seeking to do that. What we're trying to do is avoid consequences and attacks on our humanitarian partners. Many of these NGOs, including people like Syrian American trauma surgeons, are taking tremendous personal risks, and we know they're being targeted. Bakeries in opposition-controlled parts of Aleppo are targeted. There have been 143 deaths amongst medical personnel in and around hospitals who are trying to provide critical surgical support to people that have been harmed because of the brutality of the Assad regime. There have been there have been other deaths of UN workers and others. So with that safety consideration in mind, we're doing absolutely everything we can. Furthermore, Secretary Kerry announced this past weekend an acceleration of our direct support to the Syrian Opposition Council of $250 million. That investment is designed to help the SOC with our co-branded partnership deliver basic services in opposition-controlled areas, provide everything from garbage and trash removal to helping to restart electricity grids and provide generators and fuel. And those are the types of things that we also believe ought to be co-branded, so America is recognized as standing with people in opposition-controlled parts of Syria.
Absolutely right. I appreciate your highlighting that. In the short time I have, it gets frustrating sometimes, frankly, to hear some of the criticism of foreign aid, this false choice that we're given, that we can invest in schools abroad or we can invest in schools here. We can invest in infrastructure abroad, we can invest in infrastructure here. It's a false choice. You rightly pointed out that our entire foreign aid budget is less than 1% of the overall budget. But put aside, I mean, both of you, Mr. Yohannes, you're a good example too. You work with the poorest countries in the world, right? Dr. Shah, you're involved in, I went to that app that you referenced and the thousands of projects all around the world. Tell me, in the short time I have left, right, not to put the papers aside, why do you do this? Why does it matter so much for us to be engaged the way we are every place in the world?
I'll just say very briefly, this is in our core national security interest, and we've seen this over and over again. It's in our national security interest in Pakistan, which is a nuclear power about to go through what we believe will be the first civilian election and hopefully peaceful transition of power they've experienced post-independence. It's in our national security interest in Afghanistan, where it brings our troops home. And as Daniel has spoken about, it's in our national interest in Africa,
right.
Where six
and Dr. Shah, I'm sorry, I only have a couple seconds left. Mr. Yohannes, speak to that, please, Dr. Shah.
The same thing is also in our national interest. I mean, if you look in terms of many of the countries that were assisted by us, whether South Korea, Thailand, and Taiwan, they have now become our major trading partners. We're doing the same thing. Many of the countries that we're helping today are going to be our major trading partners in the next 15, 20, 30 years. It's about creating jobs here. It's also about increasing the dividends. At the same time, also helping those countries and also really creating the best trading partners for us in the future. So it is in our national interest. It is about our security. It is about our prosperity.
All right. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's go to Mr. Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you gentlemen being here. Thanks for your input. My question, I guess, is coming from a representative of the people of the 3rd Congressional District in North Central Florida, and I appreciate Mr. Deutsch's comments that it's only 1%. When I go back to the district, you know, I come from a district that has 85% of the people said they want to end all foreign aid, period. I've got to sell this to them, and I can tell them it's only 1%. What difference does it matter? But when I have the mother struggling to send her child to school at a university, or they have to pay out-of-state tuition, and she says they can't do it, and we've got $41 million going to Pakistan, it's a hard sell. To ask people in this time, in this economy, in our country, that we're going to give this aid to them, but yet you're getting laid off because of sequestration in our country. And I think of the words of Ronald Reagan, unless a nation puts its own financial and economy house in order, no amount of aid will produce progress. We've been doing this, I don't want to say a game, but our policies have been going on for over 30, 35, 40 years, longer than that, but I've been paying attention to that. And I see some improvement, but I see a lot of stuff going in the wrong direction. When you see countries, and I kind of resonate the words of Mr. Shabbat's, that we send aid, but yet we don't want to tell it where it's coming from. And I stand with him in putting a big red and white blue flag on any aid that goes over there, whether it's a bushel of wheat or a bushel of corn, that said this product was produced by, paid for by, and sent by the American people. Because to go down the path that we're going down, it's a hard sell when I go back and face the people at home. And I know you guys are doing a job that you talk about, and you're putting forth the effort to expand economic development. You were talking about the economic development in El Salvador. It's growing 9%, or in Nicaragua. Yet our economic development in this country is not going real well. And I'm reverberating the frustration that I hear at home. And you talk about the transparency and the accountability in these programs. And you were saying, Mr. Yohannes, that you run your organization like a business. And Dr. Shaw, you talk about you're at the top of your organization. Who holds the person at the top of those accountable when we come up with the fraud, the waste, or the abuse? Who answers to that? It really wasn't a question that you can answer. It's more of a rhetorical. I guess my question is, what direction do you see the American government going in as far as foreign aid, and what should our role really be? Are we looking to economic development, or are we looking at, you know, just giving foreign aid as a forward that becomes more of a foreign welfare, in which case it does no good?
You know, I believe, and the President has spoken about this very consistently, and this budget reflects that these are tough times. We presented a budget that's 6% lower than it has been for that purpose. We also believe that foreign assistance should be about creating the conditions where aid is no longer needed. And this pathway from dependency to self-sufficiency and dignity should be at the core of what we do. The single most important reflection of that principle in this budget that has been sent to Congress by the President is the food aid reform proposal. It has bold and important reforms embedded in it to allow us to reach 4 million additional people while also achieving $500 million of mandatory budget savings. It allows us to actually expand the effectiveness of our efforts, saving more lives in difficult situations, while moderating and having, as Secretary Vilsack has noted, no significant perceptible impact on American agricultural produce and value. We know that we can do a better job, and when we can, some of these programs are 6 decades old. We want to work with you to have a reform approach that allows us to be more effective and efficient, because I think we all want to be able to go back to the American taxpayer and say, however we conducted our mission, our priority was getting the most value for money we possibly
I'm going to cut you off there, and I appreciate that. And I hope you do pare those programs down. And Mr. Johannes, if you can jump in there for the next remaining few minutes, or seconds.
My colleague Raj and I have two different purposes, and we both promote U.S. government interests worldwide. We work with countries that are poor, but those that are well-governed, countries that have embraced American values, countries that have taken responsibilities for their own growth. This is countries that we believe would be our future trading partners because they want to replace aid with investment from the private sector. Countries that are really committed to reform, which is very difficult to do, but countries that are creating the best investment climate that would help American businesses in the long term, because we need some trading partners. Like I said earlier, many of the countries that we support in the past are now our major trading partners. South Korea, between the two of us, we do over $100 billion in trade investment-related activities.
I appreciate your time. My time has expired, and I'll yield what time I don't have back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Ms. Karen Bass of California.
And thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing today. Appreciate it very much. And I want to thank both of you for your excellent work from your organizations. And I wanted to take issue with my good colleague from California who says that we shouldn't use tax dollars for development, but only for emergency aid. And both of you, I think, have been doing a great job today explaining the work of your organizations. But I'm going to ask you in a minute to give examples of specific projects instead of the 10,000-foot level. I disagree with the part that says that we should only focus on emergency aid, because I believe that the work of both of your organizations really leads to us, well, really leads to preventing the type of emergencies that take place. And I think that Mr. Johannes was just referencing that, and I think the example of Korea is a wonderful example, and I see that future in Africa. Mr. Shah, Dr. Shah, I would love for you to talk about Feed the Future and Africa's long-term goal, our long-term goal. And Mr. Johannes, I first want to thank you for sending Cassandra Butts to Los Angeles. She did a wonderful job speaking with small businesses in my district about how this is about business relationship between the United States and Africa. So if you could both give an example of how the work of your organization leads to us in the long term not needing to have the level of foreign aid that we do now, how development leads to that with a specific Feed the Future example. And then, Mr. Johannes, if you could talk about Benin and the port and regional integration in Africa.
Thank you. You know, with respect to Feed the Future, this was a program that President Obama asked us to create and implement in order to move people from dependency to self-sufficiency using agriculture to address extreme poverty. We have implemented the program in 19 countries. We've actually, to focus our efforts, cut and eliminated agricultural programs in 23 other countries. In each country we work in, they adhere to a set of commitments and reforms, some of which are to increase domestic expenditure on agriculture to 10%, some of which are to avoid export bans in the sector so there can be more trade and investment. As part of this effort, last year at Camp David, President Obama brought together the American industry along with this and said, what can we do to accelerate the partnership with private investment, and got companies to commit $3.5 billion of agricultural investment to these countries. And today we're seeing the results. In Ethiopia, in a partnership with USAID and DuPont and the people of Ethiopia, we're doubling maize yields and significantly improving access to improved crop varieties.
Thank you. I saw an example in Kenya of U.S. companies that were essentially lending their scientific expertise as well as products that was helping Kenya move forward. Mr. Johannes?
Thank you, Madam Congressman. It's about 70% of our investments are concentrated in the continent of Africa. We're building the infrastructure for those countries. We're building the roads, the bridges. Like in Benin, we were able to spend about $180 million to expand the port. Now, that port has been able to get additional investment from the private sector for $200 million. That port is a lifeline for Benin and for many of the countries around that region. And as a result of our investment in Benin, we've seen commerce increase significantly in the region. I just came back from Tanzania, where we inaugurated a major road that links Tanzania with Kenya. The same road is also being used by other countries in the region that are simulating trade investment activities. So unless you build the infrastructure of these countries, you know, the water and the energy and the roads and so forth, it becomes extremely difficult for some of these countries to compete globally. And they are competing today. And again, you know, working with my good friend Raj to help many of those countries become food secure. To give an example, in Senegal, where we are building the, you know, the infrastructure for the irrigation, USAID is providing the farmer training. In Ghana, where we are building many, many schools, the teacher training is also being provided in, you know, by USAID. So we work in partnership to make sure that many of these countries become self-sufficient, to win them away from aid through major policy reforms by creating the best environments for businesses to be invested in those countries. So we are complementing AGOA. I know, Madam Congresswoman, you've been very much involved in AGOA, but we are a good complement for AGOA. Without infrastructure,
Exactly.
it is very difficult for many of the African countries to take advantage of the opportunities that exist.
I appreciate that, and we actually just had a breakfast earlier this morning talking about AGOA, and one of the things that we consistently hear from African countries is that they want to move beyond trade, beyond aid. It is about trade. To the extent that the countries are developed around the world, that is more business for our companies in the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. We now go to Mr. Cook of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A previous question was asked about the corruption in Afghanistan. And I want to kind of went on a visit over there. I was very impressed with actually the military, impressed with the Afghan army and some of the aid programs that have been done. Corruption's a big problem, and I know that there's kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod when you start talking about the poppy and the drug situation, which it's almost analogous to Colombia, what, 15, 20 years ago, about how it was still being. And I'm kind of a cynic on this, and I'm very surprised at the way things have turned out in Colombia. Because of the political situation there and this variable, can you address that on the poppy? Because they're talking about this year is going to be a bumper crop over there again, and whether money that might be intended for other programs is going to go to support that underground economy, which is obviously very, very successful.
Thank you. First, thank you for your visit to Afghanistan and for taking the time to engage with our USAID team and look at those projects. This is part of an important shared civilian-military effort to help establish a degree of stability, both economically, socially, and from a military perspective, to allow our troops to come home and to reduce the long-term national security threat. Poppy is a huge challenge. We've seen big ups and downs. The core drivers, and we've learned this from Peru, from Colombia, from other areas where we've had successful what are called alternative agriculture or alternative development programs, the core drivers of getting people out of that illicit economy into the licit one is making the opportunities in the licit economy more productive and more economically rewarding. So one of our major areas of partnership and investment has been in agriculture in Afghanistan. We help with improving wheat yields, for example, bringing more high-value agriculture, working for export opportunities to the Gulf and to other countries in the area. And really one of the few things that has been really effective at getting people out of poppy into these other areas is creating those market and economic opportunities that are safe and legal and financially, fiscally rewarding to smallholder producers and to small businesses there. And we've seen some real progress in that setting, but but it continues to be a major challenge.
Well, and thank you for that answer, but can you also address the fact that I was under the assumption, which is always dangerous, that the poppy was going to the Western countries, but now the big market, or part of it, is Russia, and that avenue is somewhat open. And if you could just address that very briefly, too.
Sure. Well, that's accurate, and part of our approach is to help manage and bring much more transparency to and fight corruption at trading posts and border crossings, both for combating poppy trade and revenue flow from that, but also just to help the Afghan government collect real customs revenue in a transparent way so they can have domestic revenue replace aid over time. As they really take on the sustainability of these efforts on their own. So all those things go together and cause a real focus on regional trade, and that brings you quickly to trade and customs posts.
Thank you very much for answering my questions. I yield back.
We'll go down to Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to both of our panelists. It's a great honor to be the very last questioner out of 18. Mr. Shah, the Foreign Assistance Act was written in 1961. It's 52 years later. I heard you talk about the need to sort of revisit the way we do business, the goals that maybe were relevant half a century ago, but maybe less so today. I assume by extension from those remarks, you would be amenable to a rewrite of that act.
Absolutely. I believe Secretary Kerry in front of the panel also implied an enthusiasm to see new authorizing legislation go forward. We'd be eager to work with you on that.
You are familiar with the effort our former ranking member and former chairman of this committee, Mr. Berman, and I undertook and in fact introduced legislation in the previous Congress.
Yes.
And do I understand from your remarks that you are committing the agency and yourself to working with us on that reform legislation as we get ready to reintroduce it in this Congress?
Yes.
Okay, because we really want to work with you. We see it as something we hope will streamline efforts and more logically align the goals and directives. I mean, I have the privilege of, if you can call it that, of having been one of the only surviving human beings who wrote the last foreign aid authorization bill that became law, 1986. I was a staffer in the Senate, and if I were the aid administrator, I might like the existing law because there were over 250 objectives and priorities and goals and everything else because we just added to it over the 50 years. But I'm not sure it's a good way to really go forward. And so I very much welcome your statement because we want to make sure aid is part of the process. It's my understanding that in the past effort, aid has maybe been sidelined or stayed on the sideline. I don't want to see that. We're trying to be partners with you on the legislative end to enable the agency to go forward. So thank you. Thank you for that commitment, and I look forward to working with you and your team as we move forward. We're getting ready to reintroduce the bill, and I've already talked to the chairman about hopefully at least having some hearings perhaps about aspects of it and see if we can't try to do this on a bipartisan basis. Let me ask, what is your understanding, Dr. Shah and Mr. Johans, yours as well, and you and I had a private conversation about this, but I have to admit, I'm not quite sure I fully understand the different missions between your two organizations. And so real briefly, if you could share that with us, and then tell us how you coordinate. How do you make sure that if you're pulling out of a country, they're not getting in it, if there's a substantive reason for withdrawal? And how do you make sure that we don't have resources competing against each other or contradicting each other in a structural way?
Well, let me echo Secretary Kerry on this one. As Secretary Kerry has noted publicly and privately, we have the same mission. Our mission is to elevate the role of development and humanitarian assistance in the context of our foreign policy and in advancing our national security agenda. To do that, we have to have a broad range of tools and capabilities that can be applied in settings as diverse as Cape Verde and Afghanistan. And so, the MCC, the broad range of capabilities that USAID has through different programs, including Food for Peace, which has been an important part of today's conversation, OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the Export-Import Bank, which are playing a critical role on energy efforts in sub-Saharan Africa, are all important components of that, and we all seek to work together towards that ultimate and singular and the exact same mission. Daniel could speak to some really good examples where we've worked hard to make sure that we have an integrated approach in the field as well.
Yeah, we both work to promote U.S. government's interest. We have a very specific, narrow mission, which is we work with countries that are poor, but those that are well-governed. Countries that have embraced our American values, countries that are committed to good governance, economic governance, democratic governance, and countries that are committed to invest in their constituencies. This is countries that want to be the next emerging markets. So much different. You know, we have a scorecard system in which they have to pass many of the scorecards in the 3 buckets in order to be considered for our program. But in terms of coordination, Raj and I work very closely. We talk almost on a weekly basis. A lot of our people speak on a weekly basis, daily, on the ground. And many of our projects are well coordinated, like talked about earlier in Ghana, where we, building school, providing the teacher training. In some cases, like in Jordan, the water project we have begun earlier by USAID, and it's a scale up from what they have begun. Moldova, the same thing. We know we are doing the infrastructure for water, and they are providing the farmer training. So we work very closely, making sure that we don't duplicate each other, but rather we complement each other.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, if you will allow me just 30 seconds, since I'm the last.
Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr.
I will allow you several minutes.
Oh, you're wonderful, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. 2 points I'd like to share with you, Mr. Shah. One is the enthusiasm expressed by the chairman and the ranking member for your Food for Peace reform notwithstanding. A word of caution, as somebody who has been writing and supporting foreign assistance for over 30 years in this town, the coalition support for foreign aid is very fragile. And there are political aspects to what you propose that, with the best of intentions, could actually damage that fragile coalition. And I strongly urge you and the administration to carefully vet that as you move forward, because you may win the battle and lose the war. You heard on this committee people express, well, we just can't afford foreign aid. I agree with Ted Deutsch, it's a false choice, but there are lots of people hearing back home, a lot of Americans are under the impression that we can balance the budget just by cutting foreign aid. I mean, you hear it all the time at town hall meetings. So, I mean, it's a fragile coalition getting votes up here to support what you're both doing, and we must be cognizant of the impact of reforms that may do good, but that also fracture that coalition. And the second thing I would commend to you both is we have to have a better narrative on success. Surely we have more to talk about than Taiwan and South Korea after a half a century or 60 years of actually making these investments. What works, what doesn't? Give us some success stories that we can talk about. That's why we got to do it. It isn't always self-evident that it's in our national interest. We can repeat that. But there's certainly a strain of isolationism that's always been with us in the United States that does not accept that rationale. The more we can point to efficacy, here's what we were able to do in reducing poverty, in improving food production, in extending lifespan, in ending this disease or that disease, in actually creating a market economy that is now a full-fledged member of the international community. Those are very important success stories, especially if we can tie them to the investments we made in your respective agencies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate your graciousness.
Well, thank you, Mr. Connolly. I will remind you it is only 45% of the Food for Peace account that they're talking about. So it's a compromise that these gentlemen are suggesting and that is in the budget, a compromise which will make that 45% far more costly to the overall budget. So again, your other point was those who are concerned about the costs, this is a reduction in cost, but for those who are concerned about the humanitarian impulse here, it gets the aid there faster, more efficiently, and does not depress the local markets that impacts the local farmers. So I just wanted to take a moment and thank both of our witnesses, indicate to you both we look forward to working together, not only on food aid reform, but also on greater transparency, greater effectiveness, and we thank you again for your willingness to come up and testify, and we stand adjourned.